Now, as I said at the beginning, these legal protections for animal food producers are a valuable cocoon of protection. These laws allow producers to offload their costs onto society. And here's what I'm talking about. If I take my garbage to the front of my driveway and I leave it there for the garbage service to pick up, and I pay them to pick it up, I internalize my costs of garbage collection. That is to say, I created the garbage, I pay to have it picked up, that's appropriate. On the other hand, if I drive to a park and I dump my garbage there, I externalize my garbage collection costs, which is to say, I impose those costs on somebody else, taxpayers, society, the operator of this park, whoever. I argue that metaphorically speaking, animal food producers are dumping their garbage in our parks because they are offloading the vast majority of their production costs onto society. Let's look at what some of those costs are. I'll show you a few slides with a few different categories, and at the end I'll show you a total, and you'll get sort of the full picture. This is just the US costs associated with these practices. Fishing leads to externalized costs of about $4.5 billion. That bycatch figure of $2.4 billion, this is what that means. When commercial fisheries are engaged in looking for a particular species, like shrimp, they routinely catch in trawl nets or long lines many non-target species. Shrimp fishing is actually particularly egregious in this respect. One study shows that for every 1 pound of shrimp caught, there are 10 pounds of non-target species caught. And these include things like sea turtles, dolphins, porpoises, birds, albatross, threatened species, sea lions, seals. Every day on this planet, 200 million pounds of animals is thrown away as bycatch. That is 40% of the total catch. That is a huge figure. And it has a value that can be determined economically. In the US alone, the value of that is $2.4 billion. A few years ago, a couple of agricultural economists did a great study in which they ran a live auction. People had the opportunity in this auction to pull out their own wallets, open them up, and actually spend their own money to bid on moving animals from inhumane conditions to humane conditions. So they could move a pig from a gestation crate to a pasture. They could move egg-laying hens from a battery cage to a cage-free environment. Based on that data from that auction, which is a particularly good way to do it because you actually force people to use their own money rather than just give them a survey saying, how much would you pay? Usually those surveys don't yield accurate results, but when people spend their own money, the results are good. Based on that data, Americans are likely to be willing to pay over $20 billion per year to end the cruelest practices in factory farming. This slide shows dairy cows in what's called a zero grazing environment. Today, a majority of dairy cows are raised in zero grazing environments. These are environments where, just as it sounds, the animals never go outside. They never graze. They live in a concrete and steel enclosure. Because they get no exercise and because they spend a lot of time standing in their own waste, 100% of dairy cows are expected to develop lameness during their life. That is, they can't walk. It's painful. Many will develop other conditions like mastitis, which is an inflamed udder. Environmental costs associated with animal food production total about $37 billion. And as you can see from the slices of pie, these are things like costs associated with manure remediation. That soil erosion figure, $15 billion. If anybody saw David Montgomery's talk yesterday about the importance of soil in this country, you know that we are damaging our soil. The United Nations says 55% of soil erosion in the United States is directly attributable to animal agriculture. So this $15 billion figure represents the portion of the total erosion costs associated with all agriculture, and it's just the animal portion. All of these are just the portion of the total cost that is associated with raising animals for consumption. Subsidies are about $38 billion in this country. This is a larger number than you might be used to seeing. The reason the number I use is relatively large is I include subsidies to corn and soybeans. In this country, 80% of the corn that we raise and 70% of the soybeans are fed to animals as feed. Those crops are heavily subsidized. You can't calculate subsidies to animal food producers without including subsidies to corn and soybeans. And as you can see, the typical cost to raise a pig is almost $9 more than that animal's market value. The typical cost to raise a cow is about $40 more than that market value. That difference is made up through subsidies. By far the largest component of externalized costs associated with animal food production is the healthcare costs. And again, these are only the portion of costs that are associated with consuming animal foods. That heart disease figure at the bottom, $143 billion, the total is 3 times that. This is just the cost associated with consuming a diet that is high in animal foods. So this is what, if you add up all of these components and categories, what the total looks like. It's about $414 billion. That is what animal food production costs in terms of externalized costs in this country every year. To put that number in perspective, it's about half of what we spend on Social Security each year. It's about 1/4 of Canada's gross domestic product. It's a large number. Here's another perspective on that number. That yellow bar is the annual retail sales of animal food. That's about $251 billion. The blue bar in the middle is externalized costs, and the green is the total when you add sales to costs. And what that does is it yields this formula at the bottom. For every $1 of animal foods sold at retail, another $1.70 of externalized costs is imposed on consumers and taxpayers. So, every time McDonald's sells a Big Mac for $5, another $8 in costs is imposed on consumers and taxpayers, us. Whether you eat Big Macs or not, somebody's buying a Big Mac right now, and we're all paying part of it. The true cost of a Big Mac isn't really $5, it's really $13. However, because McDonald's doesn't charge $13 for their products, and none of the other retailers selling animal foods charge the full cost of their products, those products have artificially low prices. Over the last 80 years in this country, as a result of widespread externalization of costs, the prices of animal foods have fallen across the board on an inflation-adjusted basis. Butter is down 44%, ham is down 48%, chicken is down 70%. The law of demand is a really simple economic principle, and it says when prices come down, demand goes up. When prices go up, demand comes down. And we've all seen this happen in our day-to-day lives. When something's cheap, you buy more. When something's expensive, you buy less. This slide shows an example of this in practice with respect to chicken consumption. And as you can see, in 1935, Americans consumed about 9 pounds per person of chicken, and today we consume about 57 pounds of chicken per person. This graph is completely unrelated to population growth. This is just per capita consumption. It's nothing to do with the fact that our population has increased. At the same time, in 1935, top left, the price of chicken was $5 a pound and is now about $1.54 a pound. In other words, the price of chicken has fallen dramatically in 80 years. Consumption of chicken has risen dramatically in 80 years, just as the law of demand predicts. It's not rocket science. Recently, in the last couple of years, if you could expand the right edges of this and blow it up a little bit, you'd actually see prices have ticked up a little bit. There's been a drought in the West and Midwest that has caused feed crop prices to go up a little, and as a result, chicken prices have gone up a little. At the same time, consumption has come down a little bit, just as the law of demand predicts. I think that when prices stabilize, prices will go down further, consumption will continue to go up. Now, let me summarize to this point. Animal food producers externalize the vast majority of their costs and impose those costs onto society. As a result of that heavy externalization of costs, they're able to lower the retail prices that they charge for their goods. Those low retail prices that are artificially low mean that consumers buy much, much more of those goods than they would otherwise. As I said earlier, Americans have roughly doubled our meat consumption in the last 80 years. During this same period, we've gone from 100 pounds per person to just under 200 pounds per person. 1 in 3 is obese, 2 in 3 is overweight. We have problems that are associated with these very high levels of consumption. It's not just health. There are environmental issues as well. I'll just give you a few data points. 1 in 3 groundwater sources in US states in this country is contaminated with animal waste. More than 30,000 miles of rivers, lakes, and of rivers and streams is contaminated with animal waste. 1/3 of the world's fisheries, commercial fisheries, have collapsed. That is, they no longer produce fish. Scientists think that by 2050, the middle of the century, all of the commercial fisheries will have collapsed because of overfishing. 2 acres of rainforest is destroyed every minute to provide land to grow crops, to feed beef cattle, or to provide land to graze beef cattle. Americans are near the top of the planet in terms of per capita meat consumption, but the rest of the planet is catching up. And when they do, the planet will be short about 2/3 as much land as we need to grow the crops to feed those animals. The land doesn't exist. It's just not there, period.